has lost their job because they wanted to join a union and they're about to lose their home. It does not hold.
Continue to watch this hearing online at cspan.org. We are going live now to Capitol Hill as the U.S. Senate is about to gavel in, beginning the day with general speeches.
Let us pray. Eternal God, you don't disappoint those who look to you in faith. Guide our lawmakers by your truth and instruct them with your wisdom. Lord, lead them to do what is right and to stay on your path. Keep them from being intimidated by the many challenges they face, knowing that your grace is sufficient for every need. May they be true to you, living so that their words and actions will receive your approval. Help them to live this day with a sense of accountability to you. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 16, 2013. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Brian Schatz, a senator from the state of Hawaii, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will be in executive session to consider the nomination of Ernest Moniz to be Energy Secretary. There will be up to 3 hours of debate on the nomination. At about 2 p.m., there will be a roll call vote on confirmation of that nomination. Mr. President, for months, my Republican colleagues have argued that the Obama administration is engaged in a cover-up regarding the tragic events surrounding an attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. The administration provided members of Congress to over 100 pages of emails sent following that attack in Libya during closed-door sessions. The emails proved there was simply no cover-up. Yet Republicans with full knowledge of these emails claimed the White House was hiding the truth. Yesterday, the administration released even more emails to the public. This is the latest effort by the administration to ensure transparency for the media and the public regarding this awful attack on Americans. This new information came out for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that we know the press corps spent most of past week chasing a story based on an email that didn't exist, was fabricated by Republican aide, and then reported as fact. It's a sad commentary that Republicans are so dead set on embarrassing the President, the Foreign Service, the CIA, and our military that they would actually lie to a news organization about the contents of an email and let that news organization report their lies as facts. The attack on Benghazi is an issue of life and death. We should be focused on tracking down the terrorists who committed this act and bringing them to justice, not on smear politics and false scandals. I hope the media will realize they're fed a false bill of goods and be more skeptical next time. On another subject, Mr. President, excuse me. 6 short years ago, the prospects for a bipartisan solution to America's broken immigration system seemed bleak. Despite support from congressional Democrats and a Republican president, an immigration reform proposal that had been defeated on a procedural vote let's say that again, Mr. President. Despite support from congressional Democrats and a Republican president, we couldn't get enough Republicans in the Senate to move forward on a reform proposal that had been defeated, I repeat, Mr. President, on a procedural vote here in the Senate. But one man who was a longtime member of the Judiciary Committee and had been chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee, Immigration for decades, Senator Ted Kennedy, reminded us all that the reform for which he fought so hard would pass one day. And that day could not be far off. This is what he said when that bill was defeated. Quote, America always finds a way to solve its problems, expand its frontiers, and move closer to its ideals. It is not always easy, but it is an American story. It's an American way. I believe we will soon succeed where we failed today, that we will enact the kind of comprehensive reform that our ideals and our national security demand. Ted Kennedy said that in 2007. Mr. President, he always spoke from back here, and I can still hear his booming voice. I can hear him saying this. Our friend Ted Kennedy was right. And I believe the time for common sense immigration reform has come. I'm sorry that Senator Kennedy is not alive to see the widespread bipartisan support for the legislation being considered today in the Judiciary Committee. Legislation I will shortly bring before the full Senate. Senator Kennedy would be very satisfied with the efforts of the Gang of 8, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. Even though Ted Kennedy was known as one of America's great progressives, his legacy is that he worked with liberals, conservatives, independents. He worked with everyone to get things done. He always was willing to set aside partisanship. And that's what the Gang of 8 has done, and that's why he would like it so much. And this Gang of 8 has done it in addressing a critical issue facing our nation. And he would applaud the diligent work of the Senate Judiciary Committee under the leadership of his longtime friend. They served together in that committee for, oh, gee, it must be 4 decades, Mr. President. Kennedy and Leahy, they did a lot of work together. And Senator Leahy has done so much in this committee work that he's done the last several weeks to refine and perfect the Gang of 8's reasonable proposal. So it's gratifying to see the momentum behind common sense reforms that will make our country safer and help 11 million undocumented immigrants get right with the law. Although neither Republicans nor Democrats will support each and every proposal, an aspect of this legislation, it's reassuring to see the diverse coalition that is formed in support of real reform. Common sense reform, reform that improves our dysfunctional legal immigration system, reform that continues to secure our borders, reform that requires 11 million undocumented people to pass a criminal background check, pay fines, taxes, and start on the path to earned citizenship. We can't do this piecemeal, and we can't do it without a pathway to earned citizenship. The thorough and open process underway in the Judiciary Committee is exemplary of how the Senate should work. So far, the committee has considered 62 amendments to the original proposal, some from Democrats and some from Republicans. In fact, the committee has adopted 12 Republican amendments, including measures to strengthen the border and improve our legal immigration system. The Senate completed work on important water resource legislation today. There's a lot going on in the Senate. I'm sorry, they completed that work yesterday, Mr. President. And we're going to begin now consideration of a crucial piece of legislation dealing with agriculture. I commend and applaud the chairman of that committee, Debbie Stabenow. She is really a good legislator. They got that bill out of that committee in a very quick fashion. So I repeat, I admire what she has done. And she's also has a new ranking member there, from Mississippi, who's a fine man and a good legislator. As I've said, as soon as it's ready, I'm going to bring that immigration legislation to the floor. We're going to start on the Farm Bill Monday. I'm going to bring the immigration bill to the floor, regardless of whether we have completed action on the Farm Bill. Although immigration is a complex and controversial issue that deserves ample time for thoughtful debate and consideration, it's also too important to delay action any longer. As a senator from Nevada and a father-in-law who was born in Russia, immigrated to the United States, I've witnessed firsthand the heartbreak of our broken immigration system. I see the heartache that it's caused for immigrants and their families. This issue is very personal to me, as I've just indicated, and it's very personal to every immigrant family striving to build a better life here in America. That's why they came here. The time has come for permanent solutions, solutions that are tough but fair, solutions that fix our broken immigration system, solutions that punish unscrupulous employers who exploit immigrants and drag down wages for every worker in America, solutions that put 11 million people out of the shadows so they can pay taxes, learn English, and get right with the law, solutions that put them on a path to citizenship so they can contribute fully to their communities and to this country. I'll do everything in my power to have this bill become law. And I'm confident that the time is right. As Senator Kennedy put it, the kind of comprehensive reform that our ideals and our national security demand. Mr. President, would you announce the work here in the Senate today?
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Energy, Ernest J. Moniz of Massachusetts to be Secretary.
Under the previous order, there will be 3 hours for debate, equally divided in the usual form.
Mr. President, I'm going to ask for a quorum. I withdraw that. When the leader finishes his time, Mr. President, Republican leader, I would ask that when the quorum call is made, that the time be equally divided between the two sides.
Without objection.
Mr. President, are we on a quorum call?
We are not.
Last night, the President took an important symbolic step in accepting the resignation of Acting IRS Commissioner Miller. I had called for this resignation on Monday when we learned that Mr. Miller signed his name to one, if not more, letters that we now know couldn't possibly have been truthful. Couldn't possibly have been truthful. But let's be clear, this symbolic step was just that, symbolic. What Americans want right now are answers about what happened at IRS, why it wasn't disclosed earlier, who was ultimately accountable for this behavior, and assurances that this kind of thing isn't going to go on at the IRS or anywhere else in the federal government. Because the allegations of ideological targeting only continue to multiply. They're continuing to multiply. This morning, I'd like to focus on just one of those incidents. It's the case of a group called the National Organization for Marriage. Last May, Senator Hatch, the top Republican on the Finance Committee, sent a letter to the IRS inquiring about reports that someone at the IRS had leaked confidential donor information from NOM, the National Organization for Marriage, to an advocacy group whose political goals were in direct conflict with its own. NOM has since released documents suggesting that this information came from one source, from within the IRS itself. All this took place, by the way, in the middle of a national political campaign. Significantly, one of NOM's donors whose name was leaked was none other than Mitt Romney. What a coincidence. And what about the group it was leaked to? Well, it was headed by a guy who was named a national co-chair of the Obama campaign and who published the confidential donor information on the website of the organization he ran, an organization opposed to the goals of NOM. So here's another situation, at the very least, clearly merits investigation. There are allegations here that someone at the IRS committed a very serious crime that had the effect of chilling the speech of a political organization that happened to be on the wrong side of the current administration. Yet a year later, Senator Hatch has yet to hear anything back from the IRS. And according to the folks at NOM, neither have they. Last year, the people at NOM say they brought their concerns about this potentially illegal activity to the IRS and the Justice Department. They say they even hired a forensic specialist to prove that the document that was leaked had originated right at the IRS. According to NOM, the forensic guy knew the document came from the IRS because it bore a watermark distinctive to the agency. And they say they had to hire him, get this, because the IRS asked NOM if they had leaked the information themselves. How about that? So they say they provided evidence to show that they hadn't leaked it themselves, and then earlier this year they asked the IRS to release all the information about their complaint, which had apparently reached a complete dead end over at the IRS. And here's what they say they got back. Crickets. They say they haven't heard a thing from the IRS or the DOJ about this potentially illegal breach of their confidential donor information, even as they've poured significant resources of their own into the investigation and, according to them, seen some of their supporters scared off. Think about that. The IRS hasn't had the time to respond to this group, or to the Finance Committee for that matter, a full year after their confidential donor information appears to have been leaked from inside the IRS to one of NOM's ideological opponents. But when the liberal group, ProPublica, requested confidential information about conservative groups, why, the IRS got right back to these folks with the information they wanted in about 2 weeks. 2 weeks. This is exactly the kind of thing I've been warning about for more than a year. Here's a group with an agenda that runs counter to that of the administration. Somebody over at IRS gets a hold of their donor list and leaks it to their opponents. Why? So anybody who thinks about supporting them thinks twice. That's why. This is what government intimidation and harassment looks like, my colleagues. It's completely unacceptable. And the idea that you've got to move heaven and earth to get somebody in the federal government to lift a finger to get to the bottom of it is a genuine outrage. This is the kind of thing that people should be tripping over themselves to resolve. Yet Senator Hatch is still waiting on a response to a letter he sent to the IRS commissioner Last May, no one should be intimidated by the government into shutting us up as part of our political process. And that's why the Republican members of the Finance Committee are sending a letter today to the Treasury's Inspector General for Tax Administration requesting investigation into this very issue. Because without this sort of inquiry, we may never have confirmed the inappropriate harassment of conservative groups that was going on at the IRS for 2 years. 2 years. Apparently, this is the only way to get this administration to take responsibility for its actions. Well, we're determined to do that because this is a very dangerous precedent being set here. I'll say it again. Americans, be they conservative or liberal, should be free to participate in the political process without fear of harassment or intimidation from their very own government. Now, Mr. President, on another matter, I would also like to note that last month the Secretary of Energy nominee, Dr. Ernest Moniz, was cleared by the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee with robust bipartisan support. The full Senate will likely vote on this nomination today. A number of my colleagues and I are optimistic about Dr. Moniz's pragmatic approach to solving America's energy challenges. In particular, I look forward to working with him on finding a sustainable, long-term solution for the Paducah Gaseous Diffusion Plant, a facility that benefits our country, its community, and the many dedicated workers who work there. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Oregon.
The nomination of Dr. Ernest Moniz to head the Department of Energy is now the pending business here in the Senate, and I would like to discuss the nomination. I note my friend and colleague, Senator Murkowski, is here. Both of us will just take a short amount of time to discuss Dr. Moniz's qualifications, and I would urge colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the nomination of Dr. Ernest Moniz to serve as the Secretary of Energy. In my view, Dr. Moniz is smart about energy policy. He is savvy about how the Department of Energy operates, and he is solution-oriented, which is what Democrats and Republicans on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee saw when he was before our committee to consider his nomination. Now, I'm going to talk about why I believe Dr. Moniz is well qualified to spearhead our efforts to evolve our country's energy system, to increase domestic sources, emit less carbon, and to bolster our economy. First, though, I'd like to talk for just a few minutes about the job that Dr. Moniz will be stepping into once he is confirmed. Right now, the Energy Department is at the center of issues that are hugely consequential to our economy and the environment. They are how to manage the newly accessible reserves of natural gas, combating climate change, and making our economy more efficient. And certainly, front and center is how, on a bipartisan approach, we can support the development of new energy technologies. I believe our country needs that kind of energy to transition to a lower carbon economy. And it's built on three pillars: strong economic growth, shrinking our carbon footprint, and spurring energy innovation. What is unique about this moment is now, on the issue of energy, our country is truly in a position of strength. Historically, lawmakers have avoided energy issues until there's a short-term crisis. Usually that crisis is a spike in the price of gasoline. Then, as we know, there's a big hue and cry to pass a comprehensive energy bill. We kind of put that in quotes, Mr. President, and it ends up being, quote, comprehensive and still lasts a relatively short period of time, maybe a year and a half or 2 years, until there's another hue and cry to pass yet one more comprehensive bill. Right now, the Congress and the executive branch, the Energy Department, are in a rare position, a position where we can make policy at a time when our country does not face those kinds of short-term calamities. Now, I say that in no way minimizing the extraordinary challenge of climate change. That is, in my view, Mr. President, a potential catastrophe that demands real and immediate action. And it is something that cannot be ducked. It is something that cannot be ignored. On energy, however, the usual calculus has been flipped on its head. New technologies have unlocked potentially massive supplies of natural gas, as well as new oil reserves. At the same time, thanks to a combination of improved efficiency, increased renewable power generation, and the rise of affordable natural gas supplies, our carbon emissions actually fell recently. A decade ago, no one dreamed of either of those facts. So one of the most immediate issues that will face Dr. Moniz, if he's confirmed, is the question of how our country can maximize the benefits of unconventional shale gas. Abundant, low-cost natural gas provides our country right now with a competitive economic advantage. The reality is, all over the world, Mr. President, others want our gas. They want what we have. Our competitors in Europe and Asia, whose costs are 4 or 5 times as high as our manufacturers. And I think it's obvious this is also a national security advantage, to be able to rely on our own energy resources instead of the sources that come from unstable parts of the world that certainly don't get up every day wishing the United States well. I was encouraged by the commitment Dr. Moniz made to me to use the best, most recent data to look at questions like how building natural gas export terminals are going to affect the areas adjacent to those facilities, as well as the larger American economy. From my experience working with Dr. Moniz, I think he is more than up to the big challenges our country faces as we deal with this historic transition in our energy sector. He knows how the department works from the inside, and he knows it because he actually has experience there. With his background as a well-respected scientist, I'm confident Dr. Moniz is going to use the best science, the most current data, in considering the key policy issues. He's shown he's going to take an independent, data-driven approach as a professor at MIT and director of that university's energy initiative, and there they have led numerous cutting-edge studies on a range of energy issues. Now, Mr. President, in one sense, the Department of Energy really ought to be called the Department of Innovation. One of the bright lights there is the Advanced Research Projects Agency, what is called ARPA-E, which funds research with the potential to produce major breakthroughs in energy technology. It was authorized in 2005, and it was Dr. Moniz's predecessor, Secretary Stephen Chu, who oversaw the first projects there, and to his credit, he was an important champion for that agency in its early days. One of the dozens of efforts that were supported by ARPA-E, for example, is a project at the University of North Dakota that aims to reduce water usage at power plants. According to the Department of Energy, the university is testing an air-cooled absorbent liquid that retains and releases moisture to cool power plants that could result in efficient power production with minimal water loss. I think it would be fair to say, Mr. President, you could put together a pretty impressive filibuster if you wanted to just describe the various types of research going on or the research that's funded by the department. They're leading research into a number of areas that our country needs to continue to work on if we are to achieve that objective that I have staked out, and that is to secure a lower carbon economy. Energy efficiency, the lowest cost way to reduce energy use and cut emissions, is going to be a big part of the department's mission in the next 4 years. Our committee is moving ahead in that area, starting with yet another bipartisan bill. A bipartisan bill, Mr. President, the Shaheen-Portman legislation, that in my view is really the standard bearer now for energy-efficient legislation. We passed it out of the committee with broad bipartisan support, and I hope it will come to the floor of the United States Senate very soon. The department is also doing important work on carbon capture, carbon sequestration, and utilization, trapping emissions from fossil fuel operations and storing them underground to reduce the impacts to our climate. The chair of our Public Lands, Forests, and Mining Subcommittee, my friend Senator Manchin, has a great interest in this particular area, and Dr. Moniz, to his credit, has said that this is an area that deserves a significant amount of attention. DOE research has also helped show that natural gas and renewables aren't mutually exclusive, that this country does not have to choose between the two. In fact, natural gas plants, in my view, make great partners for intermittent renewables like wind and solar because they can fire up and power down quickly. That's a very important part of our future energy agenda. We want to have more wind and solar. We know they're intermittent sources. And so some of the challenges the President of the Senate knows is about how to find innovative approaches to storage and looking at natural gas to help us get wind and solar into our baseload power structure. So this is an important issue with renewables also benefiting natural gas. The Energy Department's Pacific Northwest lab in Richland, Washington, across the river from Oregon, is going to soon test a project to use solar energy to make natural gas plants 20% more efficient. Now, I'm not going to pretend to know everything about engineering, but I think it's worth noting that the New York Times said earlier this month that that idea, the idea that's being explored in Richland, Washington, would use concentrated solar rays to heat natural gas and water to about 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit and break open the natural gas and water molecules. The result would create something called synthetic gas, which burns more efficiently than natural gas alone. This would give you more energy for every molecule of gas burned, which means lower cost and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is just one of many projects the Department is backing. We're not sure which are going to ultimately, pan out, but the potential for breakthroughs like the one I've described are exactly why it's so important for the Energy Department to have a broad research portfolio. Our country's competitors aren't sitting back and waiting for our country to do all of the world's innovation. China, Germany, and others are pouring resources into R&D to try and get an advantage. And the fact that we have our Energy Department on the front lines of this fight to show the world how to innovate is a huge American asset. Finally, a significant portion of the Energy Department's budget goes into an office that's described as environmental management, and which essentially means cleaning up America's radioactive nuclear waste. There are 17 active sites that the Department is currently cleaning up, including the Hanford site in southeastern Washington. Whistleblowers and independent watchdogs like the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board have identified some troubling problems with how waste is stored at Hanford, including the potential for hydrogen to build up and explode in several waste tanks. They've also flagged ongoing design issues with the facility that will treat the site's nuclear waste, another matter that the Department of Energy must solve. People who live near Hanford and depend on the Columbia River received some welcome assurances from Dr. Moniz at the hearing that Senator Murkowski and I brought some of these issues up in, where Dr. Moniz said that the status quo with respect to the Department of Energy on Hanford is not acceptable. I look forward to working with them on that long-term solution. Finally, Mr. President, I think it is fair to say that Dr. Moniz, and it's appropriate to close with this, has a long track record of collaboration. That's why I mentioned early on that he showed at his confirmation hearing, and he showed Democrats and Republicans alike, that he is solution-oriented and collaborative on the difficult questions that are ahead. He brings that scientific credibility that I've outlined with real-world policy experience that is so important to managing a major federal agency. Mr. President, based on the bipartisan support my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have expressed for Dr. Moniz in a usually gridlocked Congress, I feel like C-SPAN almost ought to put out a warning to viewers not to adjust their television, because this really is how the United States Senate ought to be working. One of the reasons that we've had the bipartisan approach on energy issues that I've been discussing, and it was demonstrated again this morning in the Energy Committee, is my friend and colleague, Senator Murkowski, consistently meets me at least halfway, often more, on these big issues. And I just want to thank her for that cooperation on the Moniz nomination and many other matters. And, Mr. President, I look forward to Senator Murkowski's comments. I see other colleagues here who may wish to speak at this time, and I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I appreciate the opportunity to follow my friend and colleague, Senator Wyden from Oregon, the chairman of the Energy Committee, to speak today about the confirmation of Dr. Ernest Moniz to be our nation's Secretary of Energy. And I think it is good when we are able to stand as the chairman and the ranking member and really come to terms of agreement insofar as support for an individual for a position such as Secretary of Energy, an important position within this administration, an important position just from the perspective of how we move forward in this country dealing with our energy issues, dealing with our energy future, which I think is where we get relatively enthusiastic about this nomination. So I'd like to thank our chairman, the chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources, my friend from Oregon, for his leadership in advancing the nomination to the finish line. I also want to recognize and thank the members of our committee for their very thoughtful questions. When we had Dr. Moniz before the committee, it was perhaps one of the smoother confirmation hearings that we have had in quite some time. And I also thank the full Senate for working with us so that we can fulfill our constitutional responsibility for advice and consent here today. Now, before I speak to Dr. Moniz's qualifications, and I do think that Senator Wyden has addressed those very well, I'd like to take just a moment to discuss the agency that he will soon lead. The Department of Energy was created back in 1977. This was just following the oil embargo that caused the gasoline shortages that we saw around the country. And the architects, those who put together the contours of DOE, were surveying a very different energy landscape than what we face today. Back then in 1977, energy was really viewed from the position of scarcity rather than the abundance that we recognize today. And those architects, as they defined what a Department of Energy would look like, what it would hope to achieve, the mission set there, they had some pretty high hopes for what the department would accomplish. And I think what you need to go to is you look back to that Organic Act, which states that DOE would, quote, promote the general welfare by assuring coordinated and effective administration of federal energy policy and programs. Pretty simple. And that same act goes on to list 18 different purposes, a few of which bear repeating. One of them is to assure to the maximum extent practicable that the productive capacity of private enterprise shall be utilized in the development and achievement of the policies and purposes of the Act. Another one of those purposes is to provide for the cooperation of federal, state, and local governments in the development and implementation of national energy policies and programs. And then a third purpose is to carry out the planning, coordination, support, and management of a balanced and comprehensive energy research and development program. So looking back then at DOE's creation is a reminder really of how far we have come and yet how far we still have to go in achieving these various purposes that were set out in that Organic Act. Today, the department is a major department. It has a budget of more than $25 billion each year. Thousands of scientists work on cutting-edge technologies at our national labs as they look for breakthroughs and managing our nuclear weapons programs. And yet, more than 3 decades later, it'd be difficult to find many who truly believe that we have achieved this coordinated and effective administration of federal energy policy. In fact, you're going to have some who would disagree as to whether or not we have developed a federal energy policy that adequately serves our national needs. Instead, we have seen energy-related programs and initiatives that are fragmented and scattered throughout the federal government. Not enough money, in my view, is getting to the bench for research and development, a critical aspect of how we build out that energy policy, a critical component of how we move towards our energy future. And all too often it appears that we have silos within the department that stand in the way of progress. In recent years, I've become concerned that DOE is not clearly and unambiguously working to keep energy abundant, affordable, clean, diverse, and secure, principles that I think really go into defining a good, strong federal energy policy. As I see it, DOE in particular must be a stronger voice in the councils of this administration for energy supply. And in light of several costly failures, the department must become a better steward of taxpayer dollars. So all of these challenges and more will be inherited by our next Secretary of Energy. But along with the challenges, I think we recognize that there are great opportunities within the energy sector. And that's why I believe that we will do well to place Dr. Ernie Moniz, who is clearly a man with talent and experience in both the laboratory and in public policy maker. I think we will do well to place him at the helm of this department. Dr. Moniz has some pretty impressive credentials. He's a physicist. He graduated from Boston College before completing his Ph.D. at Stanford. He served in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and as an undersecretary at the Department of Energy during the late 1990s. For the vast majority of his career, he's also served as the director of the MIT Energy Initiative. He has studied and written about nuclear energy, natural gas, innovation, really any number of topics that would have direct relevance for the future of our energy policy. So he has both. He has the academic experience, most certainly, as we see at MIT and at Stanford, but he's also got that practical application. My colleague from Oregon has described him as solution-oriented, and I think that that is a very apt description. He is an impressive nominee. In our meetings, where it's nice and casual and relaxed, and you can have a pretty good conversation, I was very impressed with not only Dr. Moniz' just background and experience, but how he views moving forward within the Department of Energy. There is a level of just comfortable confidence that I found encouraging. He has shown that he understands what his job requires, and that because of that, I believe he will be a capable secretary. He's knowledgeable, he's competent, and he's refreshingly candid, and I think that that's an important part of it. I kind of challenged him in the confirmation hearing before the Energy Committee to keep that up. Don't be afraid to speak out, to be refreshingly candid. I think that that's good advice. He is also proof that the Senate's confirmation process can be navigated successfully excuse me, without undue delay, as long as questions are answered and concerns that were raised by members were taken seriously, and I think he did attempt to do that. It is my hope that after his confirmation, Dr. Moniz will guide our nation's energy policy as the respected scientist that he is, and do so rigorously, robustly, free of preordained conclusions, and again, not afraid to speak up or to speak his mind. His department will benefit, and I think that the country will as well. I've indicated in my comments that I think that the Department of Energy needs good, strong direction. It needs that leadership, and I believe that Dr. Moniz will provide both. That's why I am supporting his nomination and why I ask my colleagues here in the Senate to join me in voting to confirm him later this afternoon. Mr. President, I note that my colleague from New Jersey is here. I do have some comments that I would like to make about the Arctic Council meeting, but I would certainly defer to my friend from New Jersey for his comments this morning.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
I want to thank the distinguished ranking member for her courtesy, and I do intend to support this nominee for all the reasons that the chairman, distinguished chairman, has said. But I rise at this moment as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, outraged at the implication that we in the Senate have not done enough to investigate what has happened in Benghazi, that we have not investigated it thoroughly, that we have not looked at the details, have not analyzed the information, classified and unclassified, that has come before us. The committee has held 4 hearings, 4, on the attack on Special Mission Benghazi. The very first hearing I chaired in January was on this topic with Secretary Clinton. In fact, we postponed the nomination hearing of Senator Kerry so that Secretary Clinton could come before us and explain what happened and why, despite her medical condition at the time. Let's make that very clear. One of the very first things we did, despite a pending nomination of a new secretary and the sitting secretary's medical concerns, was to hold a hearing on this topic and air the facts. Prior to that, Chairman Kerry held a hearing of the committee on December 20th on the events that transpired in Benghazi with Deputy Secretaries Burns and Nides. There were also 2 classified briefings in December, specifically on the circumstances surrounding the attack. The December 13th briefing included a video of the attack with high-level officials from State, the Joint Staff, Defense Department, the FBI, and the intelligence community. Patrick Kennedy, the Undersecretary of State for Management of State, Matthew Olson, the Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Major General Darrell Robinson, the Vice Director of Operations of the Joint Staff, Gary Reed, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, Jenny Lay, the Deputy Assistant Director at the FBI. On December 19th, there was a high-level classified briefing with the Accountability Review Board with Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen. At his nomination hearing in January, Secretary Kerry also fully addressed this issue, and then again at the committee's annual budget hearing this past April. Last week, the nominee to be our new ambassador to Libya, Deborah K. Jones, testified before the full committee. Another opportunity for my friends on the other side to ask questions, to get the truth, not create their own truth for political purposes. That hearing was yet another opportunity to ask questions about the security situation on the ground. And yet, Republican participation was limited to just a handful of members. We have fully vetted this issue. We have held hearing after hearing. We have, on both sides, had the opportunity to have our questions answered. In fact, in total, between the House and the Senate, there have been 11 hearings on Benghazi, 25,000 pages of documents released, and now full email history of the interagency process. Our focus now should not be on the work product of the CIA or State on draft talking points we've seen in hundreds of emails released by the White House yesterday. It should not be to score political points at the expense of the families of the 4 victims. It should be on doing all we can to protect our personnel serving overseas and provide the necessary oversight and legislative authority to carry out the Administrative Review Board's recommendations. I would remind my friends and the American people, nothing has changed. The facts remain the facts. They're the same today as they were in September, in October, in November, in December, and January. It's the rhetoric and the political calculus that has changed. In fact, the emails released by the White House further demonstrate that point. The original CIA-produced talking points, notably produced by a request by the House Intelligence Committee for media interviews, clearly show that in the days immediately after the attack, the intelligence community was not sure what exactly happened or who was responsible. The points produced by the CIA said the agency's belief that the events in Benghazi were spontaneously inspired by the protests at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo and evolved into a direct assault against the U.S. diplomatic post in Benghazi and subsequently its annex. That point stays in the talking points from beginning to end of the interagency process with no debate and is conveyed to the House Intelligence Committee. Throughout the email discussions, the agency makes clear that their information is limited and that there is a lot they simply don't know. In fact, the National Counterterrorism Center says in one email, quote, "At this point, we are not aware of any actionable intelligence that this attack was planned or imminent. The intelligence community is combing through reporting from before and after the attack to determine the full extent of who was involved." End of quote. It became clear over time that this was, in fact, a calculated terrorist attack, but there was no political calculation involved in the initial assessment. So let's be honest about what's happening here. It's not about doing all we can to find the truth and making sure it never happens again. It's about political gamesmanship and finding someone to blame. I would remind my friends and the American people that, again, nothing has changed. They want to make this a political issue to drive a purely political agenda. But I believe our real focus, our honest focus, what the American people truly care about is the security of our missions and the safety of our personnel, and that has been and will remain the clear focus of the Foreign Relations Committee going forward, and I hope that we will have the support of our Republican colleagues. In my view, the Monday morning quarterbacking on this issue is politically driven, a perspective shared by former Republican Defense Secretary Gates, who said on Sunday, quote, "Frankly, I think my decisions would have been just as theirs with regard to sending in Special Forces teams or overflights by fighter aircraft based in Italy." Former Secretary Gates said, quote, "Without knowing what the environment is, without knowing what the threats is, without having any intelligence in terms of what is actually going on the ground, it would have been very dangerous." So I think we have common interests here. I have been working hard to ensure full implementation of all 29 recommendations made by the Administrative Review Board. Recommendations that to ensure, going forward, we are providing adequate personnel and resources to meet local conditions at more than 280 facilities in over 180 countries around the world, specifically where host nations are unable to provide the adequate protection to our diplomats. And I call on our Republican colleagues to join us in that effort. Today I am introducing legislation. I hope we will be able to count on the support of all of our colleagues to enact this crucial, time-sensitive legislation without delay, without obstruction, without political grandstanding. The bill will provide authority to fund the Capitol Security Cost-Sharing Program to permit us to move forward with construction at high-risk, high-threat posts. This account was created following the U.S. Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and at that time, it would have allowed us to construct 8 to 10 facilities per year. However, the way the Congress is funding it, it presently is funding for construction of just 2 to 3 facilities per year, despite the fact that there are at least 24 posts that fall into that high-risk, high-threat category. At that rate, it will take us over 8 years to get around to construction at just the posts at the highest risk of attack. It authorizes funding for Arabic language training and for a Foreign Affairs Security Training Center to train diplomatic security personnel. It provides contract authority to the State Department to allow it to award contracts on a best value basis rather than to the lowest bidder where conditions require enhanced levels of security. At the administration's request, the bill will authorize disciplinary action in cases of unsatisfactory leadership by senior officials related to a security incident that does not presently exist. This will allow appropriate disciplinary action to be taken against any future official in a circumstance like Benghazi. It requires planning to incorporate additional Marine security guards at overseas facilities. And it requires extensive reporting on states' implementation of the Accountability Review Board's recommendations and on the designation of high-risk, high-threat posts. I hope that we can work together to do what has to be done to protect those who serve this nation abroad. If you want to address the problem, we have an opportunity to do it. If you want to score political points, fine, but do not do it at the risk of American lives. Let's work together to fix the problem, not use it for political advantage. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor and observe the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.